I'm Lai Leong, Center for Presidential History, with my colleague Greta Swain. Today is October 29th, 2023. Right. We are in New York City. May I first start by asking you, please, to introduce yourself and tell us what you do.
Okay. All right, so I'm Steve Arbogast, Cornell class of 70. I took a master's in public affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School, what was then known as the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. And I joined ExxonMobil right out of Princeton, and I was with ExxonMobil in finance for 32 years, during which time I worked extensively in Latin America. I had overseas assignments in Rio de Janeiro and Bangkok. I finished my career as the treasurer of ExxonMobil Chemical, which included serving on boards in Australia and Saudi Arabia. So I got to see a lot of different parts of the world in this. I then taught for 10 years at the University of Houston. I was recruited to come to Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina's Business School, Keenan-Flagler, 2014, to teach finance and develop an energy program. And I'm now the director of the SMU Center at Keenan-Flagler.
Thank you. Could you please tell us how you met Professor LaFeber?
Like many of the people here this weekend, I met him taking his course, his memorable course in diplomatic history, History 383, 384, in my sophomore year. And we had a relationship that lasted from then until his death. And it was a relationship that was deeply influential from a personal point of view. As an example, when we were overseas in Brazil, Walt came down to Rio de Janeiro for a conference. And we went out to dinner, and I said, you know, I've been with Exxon for 10 years now. I've always wanted to teach. Maybe it's time for me to leave business and go back and get a PhD in like international relations. He said, don't do it. He said, you're in a really interesting place now where you can make things happen, you know. So he essentially talked me out of going into academia at that point. And I think he was being kind, because what he was really, I think, sort of saying is, you've actually missed the window. You know, if you really want to, get a PhD, it's going to take you 5 years. You're going to be, pushing 40. That's probably not the time. Then the whole tenure issue would be very, very difficult. So he did me a mercy in that regard. And our discussions went on for a long period of time. And I'll tell you something on this. We used to argue a lot. Okay? I disagreed with much of what Walt professed from day one. And as a result, we had a very interesting influence on each other over the years, because his great personal characteristic was to disagree without being disagreeable. And so you could really have deeply meaningful conversations where you got down to, well, what are your premises, that shape this, and where are they different from mine? And that was very, very interesting.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because in so many of our interviews, folks have sort of stuck to how much they found themselves influenced by, Walt LaFeber's ideas and agreeing with him. So you're actually the first that has professed disagreement, and I wanted to probe that a little bit.
Be my guest.
In what ways did you disagree with him? What were his ideas that you found disagreement with?
Well, let's start with the fact that he was very quick to characterize the American historical experience as empire building. And I think you could make a reasonable case for that when you're talking about the building of a continental empire and the whole manifest destiny experience. But empires in the international realm usually involve a power militarily conquering other lands, physically occupying them, and subjecting those lands to a deep subordination. The United States' role in the world, I think, is unique, and I think it deserves to be described not as an empire or an imperium, and those are words that appear in his books, but it's something we haven't actually ever seen before, which is a loose association of voluntary allies, which have different degrees of alignment as far as their security and economic interests, which they sometimes codify in treaties. Right? So if you think about, just take the North America. Well, you have a situation in which the United States has lived peaceably with Canada and Mexico since 1850. Okay, so for over 170 plus years, the United States hasn't been particularly interested in occupying either Canada or Mexico, but it clearly could have done that. And then it enters into extensive negotiations about trade relations. And then it did it again. And you can make a pretty interesting argument that those trade relations have greatly benefited Canada and Mexico, because you find American politicians frequently complaining about exactly that. Not to mention the influx of people from those countries across the border. This is not an empire. This is something quite different. And it's different in the relationship with Europe and the United States. It's different in the relationship between the United States, Japan, Philippines, and Australia, New Zealand. So, I recently wrote something on the Ukraine, and the Pope was quoted as talking about the United States as leading a second imperium, not terribly different from Russia. And what I wrote was, in effect, objecting to that. The point I made is, we want to talk about NATO enlargement. People were begging to get into NATO. And they were begging to get into NATO because they were threatened. Okay? So that's a really quite different kind of situation. But Walt would always characterize these things as somehow the United States was, sort of putting something over on other countries or creating, dependency and so forth. There was a kernel of truth in that in certain ways, but it was overdrawn, in my view. Okay?
How did he respond to you in those conversations?
Well, he would usually respond to me by, because he always had gone into such great diplomatic history depth in the documents, he would always conjure up somebody I'd never heard of and say, well, what about this guy, who said this at such a point in time, and of course it was another kernel of evidence, and I'm sort of sitting there thinking, okay, so now I'm going to have to take 3 years to go deep into the documents and find out, how accurate that really is, and so forth and so on. But in point of fact, I felt that, and this gets really into the second point, Walt had a critical stance toward American foreign policy, which had a great benefit. I always called it the death of naivete for me. And the idea that the United States was principled and not engaging in grubby self-interest and so forth, I think Walt put paid to that in my own thinking. But his critical stance toward American foreign policy, I think, had two other effects which at least deserve to be discussed and debated. I think to some extent it meant he really couldn't honor the achievements in American foreign policy very much. You read the Cold War book or any of his other books, and they're so critical at the end of the day. You look at Eastern Europe, you look at Greece, these are countries that, under the auspices of the American policy in Europe, NATO, the Marshall Plan, and so forth, they're tremendously much better off today than they were in 1945. Somewhere, somehow, that positive outcome, which is a really big one, needs to be recognized, and in many ways honored. And I think that the second aspect of that is, Walt built a lot of his criticism on what I would characterize as collateral damage. So, you know, he would talk in terms of, okay, the militarization of American foreign policy, you know, basically meant we couldn't focus on social justice at home, and, you know, we applied military force when maybe we could have done something else. And look, those are the interesting critiques, very much things that needed to be debated. But what was the result at the end of the day? Okay, well, you know, did Europe end up free, prosperous, and safe? Yeah. Okay, and was communism actually a really bad idea that deserved, you know, to ultimately be phased out? Yeah. And I don't think you find any of that in Walt's work. Okay, and so from that point of view, I think the critical posture, as useful as it was, it did have the effect of turning a blind eye to very significant achievements at the end of the day. You know, in preparation for this conference, I went back and dug out all my LaFeber books, because I keep them on a shelf. I have all his books, many of them with, you know, sort of personal notes from Walt in them. So I dug out the Michael Jordan book, all right? And the Michael Jordan book is written in the early part of the 21st century. It's like a 2001 book or something like that. And it concludes by saying that the, you know, sort of American approach to globalization and to the technology that underpinned it was neutral, neither good nor bad, but then it had all these negative side effects. Now, what's completely missing from the book is any mention of economic development in China or India. All right? I went back and looked in the index to see what, you know, what references to China were in there. Nothing about the economic development of China. Now, if you went out to China in 1993 or 1994, as my fellow executives at Exxon started to do, they would come back absolutely stunned by what was happening in Shanghai, what was happening on the China coast. It was no secret by 2001 that a China economic miracle was happening, and that China economic miracle was lifting millions of people, maybe hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Something similar was happening in India. That was a function of an American approach to free trade and to things like the WTO that gave those countries access to American markets and technology on which they built their economic development. You won't find it in Walt's book.
That's interesting, that observation, because of course, Professor LaFeber was known for highlighting the economic features, economic dimension of U.S. foreign policy. Why do you think then that he had that blind spot, at least with regard to that book?
Walt processed economics through its influence on diplomacy and what he found in the diplomatic record. But what was happening in this realm was really outside of government by and large. It was the working of competitive advantage and comparative advantage in international trade. So, you know, the United States made a policy decision to encourage China to enter into the WTO. And, you know, they had a hope that China would become sort of a responsible stakeholder in international thing. And if Walt was here today, he'd be writing what a failure that was. Okay. But in point of fact, you know, what that did was essentially open the markets. And, you know, it had a synergistic effect with the policy of Deng Xiaoping to allow the private sector to really go to work in China. One of the great things about China, they have a very, very strong entrepreneurial class. They have, you know, people with fabulous work ethic. And that all was unleashed in that period of time. So this is happening away from the diplomatic, you know, discussions that is going on. So Walt's following the train of thought, and, you know, so it's like, boy, you know, Clinton and Bush administrations made big mistake. It didn't work out, but that's really a function of the change that came with Xi in you know, 2011, 2012. What happened to build the China miracle? was essentially those signals to Western business. All right, and we were part of that. Exxon was part of that. We went into China and got into joint ventures there starting in 1998. Okay, so I would say it was outside the sphere that Walt would have been looking at.
Did he ask you pointed questions about that sphere, given your business background?
Yeah, it's interesting. Most of our discussion was about the Middle East and Latin America, where I spent a lot of time in my career, and you know, I did work on China in the sort of late '90s, but I don't think we you know, just through the kind of happenstance of how it worked, that didn't become a big part of our discussion. And kind of in retrospect, I wish it had.
What type of questions did he ask about the Middle East and Latin America?
Well, I think in the case of Latin America, you know, he was interested in, you know, first of all, was there kind of a view in the American diplomatic corps in the 80s and 90s that, you know, American business had an important role in Latin America at that point in time? The answer to that question is that was really drying up. You know, the United States sort of really close alignment with American business in Latin America, at least in the South American context. You might make a different argument in Mexico or Central America, but it kind of backed off at that point in time. American business was pretty much on its own down there. Middle East was a different story, and that was where we had a lot of discussion. You know, in October 1973, exactly 50 years ago, the Arab-Israeli War broke out. And that was followed by the Arab oil embargo, a quadrupling of the oil price, and then between 1973 and 1976, the expropriation of all the Western oil holdings in the Middle East and Venezuela. So from that point on, Walt and I would talk a bit about, all right, so how are Western companies actually going to deal with the threat of the same thing happening in their future investments? And this got into kind of the whole question of how he had actually a lot of respect for companies like Exxon in terms of their savvy in dealing with political risk. And I would tell him that that was painful learned experience. So, for example, you know, the question for the companies after everything got expropriated was, how are you going to go into future countries in the third world and take the same risk again and not get the same outcome? And the companies developed, and this is the kind of thing I would tell Walt about, they developed a different contractual form that actually neutralized political risk. It's called a production sharing agreement. So if you went into Angola, or if you went into Malaysia, which were the kind of countries that, you know, once you weren't going into Saudi Arabia anymore, those were the kinds of places where you would go. The production sharing agreement essentially sort of said, okay, if you were going to produce this volume of oil in this particular country, how's it going to get divided up between you and the government? And the answer was, in the beginning, most of it goes to the company. The company gets its money back very quickly and you know, a slug of profit. And then over time, the ratio changes and more goes to the government. And if the price goes up, that transition happens sooner. Now this contract, if you think about it, is a very interesting way of recutting the risk of different projects. Because it essentially said to the company, okay, you're going to be in and out pretty quickly in terms of what you risk, and you're going to get a likelihood that you're going to get a reasonable return over a long period of time. And the kind of situation where governments feel compelled to move against you, which is the price flips up and they see you making a fortune, we take that off the table because that gets given to the government by contract. So really from 1976 on, there have been very few expropriations in the oil and gas in the oil and gas business. And indeed, the only ones that I'm really very familiar with are what happened in Venezuela under the Chavez administration, which is a whole separate conversation, and the fallout of the Ukraine war, which was really driven by sanctions. Wall was very interested in that stuff, and he felt that the companies knew a whole lot about how to manage political risk. We used to talk a lot about that.
Yeah, I'm really curious to hear about that, because at least in his much earlier works, Professor LaFeber was known for talking about how economic interests drove U.S. Diplomacy, or at least that's my takeaway. That's my understanding, and so I'm still, I have to admit, a little bit puzzled that he wasn't more focused on business interests later on, as you suggest.
Well, I think the big argument that he and I always had was whether the Cold War flipped that. Okay, my argument with him was that the threat posed by Soviet communism, whether it was exaggerated, misinterpreted, or so forth, it basically was at bottom it was sort of a military political threat. And U.S. business interests weren't terribly engaged in that, except in the sort of ultimate sense that if Russia took over the world, somehow capitalism wasn't going to survive, and that was obviously a pretty remote scenario. So I felt that starting with really the outbreak of the Cold War, national security interests would dominate U.S. policymaking, and the earlier period was really about building American economic hegemony or strength and replacing Britain. So you could make a much stronger case when he wrote New Empire and stuff like that, that the U.S. government was really dedicated in building American strength, and a close alignment with so I felt that flipped, and I think Walt implicitly acknowledged that over time, but it never left his thinking entirely.
It sounds to me that what you are describing here is an evolution, really, right, of his approach, his historical view.
Yeah, I think if you go back to the Michael Jordan and Global Capitalism book, I don't think that there's a tremendous amount in there about the U.S. government promoting, individual businesses and so forth. I think it's more kind of the collateral damage associated with the kind of American business cultural imperialism and sort of some of the negative effects that had. So if you want to talk about kind of evidence of the evolution, just compare New Empire to that.
So you are here today with a lot of other folks, academics, policymakers, of course, people in industry like yourself, very successful. And despite your disagreements on the front of ideas, you are here. What was it about Professor LaFeber that brought you here?
Oh, well, I mean, there are many, many things there, and the people in the hall that's speaking about this, echo many of these points. He was the most interesting lecturer I ever came across. And many people have probably told you this, but the way in which he would build history around individuals and make it relatable. All of us walked away from his classes familiar with John Quincy Adams saying, don't go abroad looking for monsters to destroy. it was surprising that Walt thought Quincy Adams was like the greatest Secretary of State. I mean, I thought he was like a forgettable, president, and and who knew that he was the author of the Monroe Doctrine? So there was all this learning and all of this, sort of really interesting, relatable history. His lectures on Willard Straight, for example, it's like, wow. So there was that, but he was so enormously dedicated to teaching his students. So, he would be very patient with you, happy to engage in discussion. He was a great believer, and I'm going to talk about this afternoon. He was a great believer in the classic idea of the university. And he felt that the university was a vulnerable place, and that people needed to recognize that if you wanted to create a place where dedicated professionals could, spend their life pursuing truth through research and teaching, then you had to keep the environment there free from, angry politics and aggressive, ideological, combat. You had to create a place where diversity of thought was not just allowed, but encouraged. When I was at Cornell, there was a very interesting collection of conservative faculty there when I arrived in 1966. There was Einaudi, there was Alan Bloom, there was Walter Burns. These were giants in their field. And Walt had great relations with them. He didn't agree with them on lots of things, but he deeply respected them, and he prized the fact that they were at Cornell. I think he regretted greatly when the events of 1969 and 70 drove them out. And I think he devoted a lot of his quiet diplomacy inside the university after that to trying to protect the school, for diversity of thought in the faculty. And if he was here today, I think he'd be taking that position on some of the issues that beset the universities at this point in time. I deeply respected him for that, okay? And I deeply respected the way he stayed engaged with students after they went out in their careers, was interested in what they were doing, offered professional advice and went along. This was somebody, he was your lifelong colleague. How many of your faculty, did that in your particular life? And that's why everybody's in the room down there.
Tell us a little bit about his influence on your own teaching. I mean, now, you've decided to become a professor of the practice at UNC. How has he influenced your own approach to teaching?
Well, getting ready for this, I was going to comment that I modeled myself after him as a teacher. So I usually begin my classes with some kind of story. I teach in a course called Strategy of Project Finance, right now. And the very first slide in my slide deck is the story of H.L. Hunt, doing the first project financing in an East Texas oil field. It's a great scallywag story because he snuck into the oil camps of these two wildcatters and figured out that they were going to bring in a gusher. And he rushes off to two banks in Dallas to get the money to buy the leases all around their place. That's a Walt LaFeber technique. Start out with something nobody expects to see, that is a piece of history, and which, in effect, draws the student in to the outside world, draws them into the things that you want to open up to them, leads them to sort of say, wow, that was happening then. People were doing things. Someday I'm going to be doing things. Okay? Maybe what I'm going to learn in this class is going to help me do things in today's age. So that was the first point. That was a big thing. The second thing is I deliver all my lectures without notes. All right? And that was the classic LaFeber trademark. That he could talk for 50 minutes, straight on, just had all the material at his grasp. So he's looking at you, okay? He's present for you, and everything is just there. And that set the standard for how you want to engage with your students. Those are two giant ways in which he influenced me in my teaching.
How has he influenced you in other ways, perhaps as a person beyond being, a teacher or a scholar?
Well, obviously he convinced me that, having a relationship with your students, after they graduate is one of the great joys of academic life. So as an example of that, I run this Energy Center, and we have a recent alumni council. And I have all these graduates who went through my program that are out doing things, in different companies around the country in the energy space. And we convene every other month, and then I hold retreats for them when they come back to campus. And they're part of, kind of the alumni network that developed the program. We just created our LinkedIn page, and I'm going to give them chances to write blog posts for it. So Anthony Miner, who was the president of the Energy Club in 20, is now with Caterpillar. He's going to be writing on decarbonizing mining. That's going to be the first blog post that comes out. That's an example.
What would you say is the legacy of Professor LaFeber generally?
Well, I think it's got many facets, and I'm probably going to forget some that are quite significant. So, good thing you're talking to more people than me. Well, let's start with the fact that whether you agree with it, disagree with it, or think it's kind of a question of complexity and nuance, Walt served up an important critique of American foreign policy. Nobody who went through his classes could ever come out not being interested in, okay, well, what's America's self-interest in this particular situation? How is that infused into the policies that are actually going on? And are they being pursued in an enlightened and diplomatically, capable way, or in a ham-fisted and overdrawn type of fashion? So I think what come out of Walter's experience with a more critical and discerning eye toward American foreign policy in general. But then I think the second part of his legacy is what it means to be, an extremely dedicated researcher and teacher. Because in academia, you usually find one or the other. He did both. Okay, he was absolutely top-notch researcher, writer, and so forth, and absolutely dedicated to his students. And that is rare.
If I may finish off, unless you have other things to add, I'm just so intrigued by how you started, that you had disagreed with him, that you disagreed with each other in different ways. When he disagreed, what was his demeanor like? How did he carry himself? How did he take, criticism of his work? I wonder if you could talk about that in, sort of using picture words, just so that we who have not been there can imagine what he was like as an interlocutor.
Okay, so I'll give you an example that's drawn from the Cold War book. I'll give you two examples that are drawn from the Cold War book. So I would make the point to Walt, I say, Walt, you don't realize how traumatic the takeover of Czechoslovakia, the coup in Czechoslovakia was in 1948. You're talking about the militarization of American foreign policy in the Cold War, like it was kind of a sort of a military-industrial complex choice, an unnecessary choice. And I don't think you're making any allowance for the fact the utter ruthlessness of the tactics that the U.S. was facing at that point in time, you know, were the kind of thing that would encourage people to say, wow, we really have to make a show of not just diplomatic and economic strength, but military strength if we're going to have a balance of power that provides any sort of basis for stability. And Walt would listen to that. And then he would say, well, you do know that Czechoslovakia signed a treaty in 1943, you know, which basically gave the Russians the opportunity to sort of set up the government they wanted to in Czechoslovakia. And, you know, I would go away with my tail between my legs, you know, and so forth. And then about 2 weeks later, it would suddenly occur to me that, wait a minute, in 1943, most of Czechoslovakia was still under German occupation, okay? And he must have been, you know, there must have been like a group of exile Czech politicians in Moscow that signed this treaty. And you know, and I would have to like get back in there and sort of say, was that really fair? That sort of thing. So, you know, where he was coming from was interesting. He was trying to say, look, there's always more to the story. Okay? And you have to look at the interests and also the reactions of your adversary. You know, you can't just process this stuff through an ideological lens. You have to look at the historical chronology. You have to look at who did what, when, and who was reacting to what. And that was a lot of what his work was all about. So, you know, to answer your question is, that was a never-ending process. We carried on these discussions for 50 years, you know, and he was always adding something new to the equation.
Thank you. Is there anything that my prompts did not elicit that you want to add to the record?
You know, I think I got some of the main points that I thought for balance, you know, or your oral history should really have. And if I were going to leave those you know, with a couple of final thoughts, I would say that the American government largely leaves international business on its own out there now. You know, indeed, it's a situation in which the nexus between economic policy and international relations is probably about reshoring American business in strategic areas, like in the chip industry. It's a bit about strengthening political relations with satellite, now let me call them, that's probably a bad choice of words, alternative international sources of economic integration. Vietnam, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, those kinds of places. You know, I think you're now seeing a new nexus, really, as part of the sort of recalibration of strategy, you know, toward China in the Far East. And I would say that, and this is something that I should put on your radar screen as well, particularly if you're at SMU. The energy transition is going to hit a reef because of its neglect of the oil and gas supply situation in the short to medium term. We got a dose of this with the Ukraine war, but what's happening is a massive underinvestment in oil and gas, which is delivering market power back to the oil cartel. And if we get any sort of, you know, economic growth in the global economy again, sort of a lull in economic growth, you're going to see oil prices, you know, really ramp up. So there's this question, how are you going to reconcile the energy transition and not having geopolitical hiccups due to oil supply in the interim? And I think one answer to that question is that the U.S. fracking revolution has to go to international countries. So we're actually going to do a conference on global fracking at UNC in next April. I think you're going to start to see the international companies like Exxon and Chevron go into new countries to do hydraulic fracking. Algeria, for example, and that's a good thing because, you know, unlike traditional oil and gas development, fracking is easy to start, it's easy to stop, doesn't leave the stranded assets that you have in other places. So it actually fits well into the energy transition. If it turns out the IEA is right and fossil fuel demand begins to really go down by the end of this decade, fine, you won't need too much fracking. If OPEC is right, and they're predicting 160 million barrels a day of oil demand by the end of the decade, we're going to need it a lot.
Thank you very much.
All right.